After our daughter Abigail was born, she was born in February of 2021, there was a good few years where there was no photos of her hung up in our home whatsoever. Pretty typical third child scenario. And then my wife, for obvious reasons, would regularly ask me to, print some photos, get them organised, hang them up. That's the kind of the jobs that I do around the house. And I would always say something like, oh, yeah, I'll get to it this weekend, or I'll be on holidays in a month, I'll organise it then. I'd always sort of affirm that she's making a good and positive request and say, yes, I'm going to get right to it. And lo and behold, years passed and no change. So in 2024, when I went off on a short-term mission for 3 weeks, she took the opportunity, she bit the bullet, she went and she picked the photos that she wanted, she printed them, she bought frames, she hung them up, she did a very good job. Needless to say, I was pleasantly surprised when I returned home from our mission trip to see photos of all our children and our families hung up on our walls. But I couldn't help but feel some guilt, somehow that I'd disappointed her or let her down. It's not because I didn't care, certainly not. I love my family, I love all my children, I do love my wife. But I'd made her a promise on many occasions and I'd failed to follow through. And that's an important distinction. I didn't fail because I lacked good intentions. I failed because good intentions aren't the same as follow through. We all do this, don't we? We make promises that we genuinely intend to keep, but time sometimes slips away, or circumstances can change, or our enthusiasm can fade. And it might look like in my example, promising to do a chore or complete a task, and then because we're busy and because there's so many things happening, we just forget about it so quickly and it just becomes something that we don't get around to. Or it could be committing to something like a job or a ministry or an opportunity or an event, and then realising later that actually we're pretty overcommitted. Don't really know if I have the time. This one strikes a chord. When our kids or our grandkids ask us, come and play, and we might say something, yeah, I'll be there in a minute. And then we lose the next half an hour doom scrolling on our phones or whatever it is that was keeping us too busy. Or perhaps in our Christian walk, promising God that we won't fail or fall into the same sin, the same pattern or habitual sin that we've fallen into so many times before. We won't do that again, only to repeat it months, days, or even minutes later. The desire is real, but the follow-through, not always. And that tension between wanting to do the right thing and actually doing it sits right at the heart of Peter's story. This January, as Simon mentioned in his introduction, our church is sort of pausing to reflect on some New Year's revolutions, is what we're calling them. Stories from the Bible of people's lives that have been utterly transformed and completely changed. Lives like that of the Samaritan woman, Chris did a good job a couple of weeks ago in John chapter 4, who on a chance encounter with Jesus at the well in the middle of the day, just had her entire world turned upside down, and her understanding of herself and her God and worship because of this encounter with Christ. Or that of David. Mike did a great job last week, and I commend those sermons to you if you weren't here on either of those 2 weeks. In Psalm 51, when David, when confronted with the gravity and the seriousness of his sin, threw himself on God's mercy and God's compassion, and those things alone to save him. So today we're looking at another life of revolution, and that is the life of the Apostle Peter. I love Peter. It's one of my favourites, probably my favourite of all the apostles. I can tell you those reasons at another time. But after 2,000 years of church history, it's sometimes we can have a rose-eyed view, or like an otherworldly view of the apostles. Somehow that they're super spiritual and otherworldly, not like the rest of us. But that's not true. They were people just like us. Peter reminds us that God works through very ordinary, impulsive, emotional, inconsistent people like us. In the Gospels, we get a very vivid picture of the type of person that Peter was. At times, he showed incredible spiritual insight. And at other times, he completely misses the point. One great example of this is in Matthew chapter 16. Jesus, and I've got the whole passage there, but I'll read just a couple of bits. Jesus had just finished asking his disciples who the people think that he is, and they responded with some responses. And then he asks them this question: who do you say that I am? And it's none other than our guy Peter that responds, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to him, Peter, you are blessed because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the forces of Hades will not overpower it. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth is already bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is already loosed in heaven. Just picture this encounter between Peter and Jesus. Imagine the spiritual high that Peter would be on at this. Like he'd be on like cloud 99 or like 9,999. Like he'd be that high. But only moments later, in the very next passage, after Jesus had finished telling his disciples of all the things that he was about to suffer, Peter, on a spiritual high, can do no wrong. Peter pulls him aside. You can try and picture this scenario. Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. And he says, and then Jesus responds to that and he says, get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me because you are not thinking about God's concerns, but man's. Whoa. One moment, Peter is speaking unknowable truths, only possible through God's revelation. And in the very next moment, he's just back to normal Peter. He's just thinking like, well, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to make this work? Very human thinking. This pattern follows Peter throughout the Gospels. We see many occasions of this. I'll give you a few examples. These stories should be familiar. When the disciples are at sea in the middle of a storm and Jesus comes to them walking on the water, Peter demonstrates incredible faith when he says to Jesus to call him out and so he can walk to him on the water. And he does that, and then as soon as he gets out there, he begins to panic when he notices the waves and the sea, and he begins to sink, needing Jesus to save him. Or on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to the top of the mount, Peter witnesses the majesty and the glory of Jesus, only to offer to build tents for him and for Moses and for Elijah, trying to meet a very human need. When Jesus went around washing his disciples' feet, this is in the upper room at the Last Supper, Peter initially refuses. You shall never wash my feet, he says to Jesus. And then when Jesus tells him that those that he doesn't wash his feet have no part with him, Peter's like, oh, okay, all right. Wash my whole body instead. Um, completely missing the point of the exercise. And then later in that same supper, after Jesus tells his disciples that they would all abandon him, Peter says with complete conviction, even if everyone runs away because of you, I will never run away. Peter is definitely sincere, and he is definitely passionate. And he's definitely completely dependent on his own strength. Peter's problem was never that he lacked love, but it was a belief that his devotion alone could carry him through. Those words hit particularly hard, don't they? How many times have you and I said the same thing to our Lord? I will never, ... or I will always, ... The temptation for us is to try and prove ourselves to God. And when we try to prove ourselves with promises, we'll always fall short, because doing things in our own strength and willpower is never enough to carry us through. Excuse me. And that's where we come to our reading in John 18. Peter, when faced with the reality that Jesus is now an enemy of the state, now he can see the signs, like he's been, he's arrested in the middle of the night, he's been hauled before the high priest, and like he can see where this is going. And that any who followed him are going to be equally as dangerous and potentially suffer the same fate. Peter did the most human thing possible, self-preservation. When confronted by a servant girl huddled around a fire, all the boldness and brashness of earlier that night seems to just vanish. It's gone in a flash. And we're left with a cowering little boy who wants nothing to do with the man at the center of this trial. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She says to him. And Peter's reply, an emphatic, I am not. And if you think, surely not, like any moment now, he'll come to his senses. He'll confess that, no, he does know Jesus. And he doesn't just know Jesus, he loves Jesus. And he's been with Jesus this whole time. And yeah, he'll make it good. Well, we know how the story goes. You'd be wrong, obviously. On 2 more occasions that night around that fire, Peter would deny that he even knows who Jesus is. And it was then that the rooster crowed, and in Luke's account of this gospel, of this story, we're told that Peter, at this point, left and wept bitterly. I can imagine the words of Jesus from a couple of hours earlier would have just come right back to him, like, oh. And he knew it. He knew he'd stuffed it. He knew he'd broken the one promise that mattered the most, that he denied his master and Lord, and he abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. And if we had to be honest with ourselves, there's a lot of Peter in all of us, making bold promises to God, to love and follow him, only to falter when things get hard or uncomfortable. Making inspired declarations of truth, only to get distracted when the rubber hits the road by our very human problems. That's the human problem, that we're short-sighted and we're inherently selfish. And we don't need to look too far to see examples in our own life where we've failed to live up to our promises to God. Because our failure to follow through is a symptom of the human condition. It's what should be expected when we do things in our own strength. And if that was where the story ends, it would be devastating. If we only had one chance to prove ourselves to Jesus and we fell at the first hurdle, where would that leave us? But by God's grace, though, that's not the end for Peter, and it's certainly not the end for us. As we didn't read the entire passage in John 21, I'll fill you in on some of the details. Steve gave us a good helpful context when he read the passage. So yes, after Jesus' resurrection, Peter and the disciples are waiting around, not sure of what to do next. Peter decides to go fishing. He just goes back to what he knows. A bunch of his friends join him, and off they go into a cold and lonely night out on the water, and at the end of it, nothing to show. Then in the early hours of the morning, a man on the shore asks them about their catch. They can't quite make out who it is. They reply that nothing, we tried all night, there was nothing there. And then this strange man who's, the scriptures tell us, about 100 yards, about the length of a footy field away, he tells them to throw their nets out to the right side of the boat, and there they'll find some fish. And sure enough, they do, and they pull in 153 fish. I think that's a big number. I don't know what their normal catch would have been, but I don't imagine it would be that high. John turns to Peter at this point and he says, "It's the Lord." And on hearing this, Peter jumps in and swims to shore while the others bring in the boat. And there they find Jesus waiting by another fire this time, with breakfast already prepared. And so sitting around this fire, once again, Peter is subject to some questions. Notice what Jesus doesn't ask Peter. He doesn't ask, why? Why did you fail me? He doesn't ask, how will you make it up to me? He doesn't ask, how can I trust you again? Instead, with a heart bent on restoring Peter, Jesus asks him this question: Peter, do you love me? Peter's denial of Christ would have certainly been the lowest point in his life, one that he may have thought there was no coming back from. And here, a window of restoration begins to open. Peter, no doubt overcome with emotion, responds emphatically that indeed he does love Jesus. 2 more times, Jesus asks him the same question, demonstrating a complete restoration and reversal of the 3 times that Peter denied his Lord. See, Jesus is not interested in rebuilding Peter's self-confidence, but rather in restoring him into relationship. Like he did for Peter, Jesus is reaching out in love to restore all those that come to him. There's no sin that he won't forgive when we come in humble repentance. No failure that puts us beyond his grace. He's holding out his hand to forgive and restore any and all that want to have a relationship with him. You may think that you've dropped the ball too many times, promised the world and failed to deliver. You may wish, like Peter, that you had the courage to stand up in the face of persecution. This moment in John 21 is where everything changed for Peter. Sure, he'd been with Jesus for 3 years, but his epic fall from grace when he denied his Lord would have left him dejected and uncertain about his future. But here in this moment, it all became real again. He had a new sense of purpose and mission. A few weeks later, at Pentecost, Peter would stand up before a crowd of thousands and publicly confess his allegiance to Jesus. Later in the book of Acts, he would be beaten and imprisoned on multiple occasions for loving Jesus. And he would go on preaching and confessing Christ right up to the moment of his death, which tradition tells us was by crucifixion, making the words of Jesus to him on that beach ring true to the very end. And this is what Jesus said to Peter in John 21:18-19, was part of our reading. I assure you, when you were young, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. And he said this to signify by what kind of death he would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, "Follow me." Peter was restored that day and found the courage to stand and be counted as one of Jesus's followers. So Jesus is asking you this question today. Not, will you do better? Or will you try harder? No. Jesus is asking, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? The encouragement for all of us is this, that revolution is possible. Not because we are strong, but because Jesus is gracious. Peter's story tells us that failure doesn't have to be the end. God's grace can rewrite our story. So the question that lingers is the same question that Jesus asked on that beach. That question. Do you love me? And if your answer is yes, even a shaky, imperfect yes, Jesus says to you what he said to Peter, follow me. So what does following Jesus look like for us? A couple of helpful verses. We may not be called to stand before hostile crowds like Peter did at Pentecost and to preach the gospel to thousands, but we are called to live out the gospel in our family, in our community, in our universities, in our workplaces. Or to use the words of Peter again in 1 Peter 3:15, but honour the Messiah as Lord in your hearts. Always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. We may not face persecution and be destined for martyrdom like Peter was, but the words of Jesus in Matthew 16, verse 24, he says, if anyone wants to come with me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Let's pray.